get started with the third and final day of AGI-08. I'm thankful to everyone who's gotten up early in the morning to come down here. It's more early mornings in a row than I'm used to. That may be the case for some others as well. But we've got a quite interesting session this morning focused on neural network modeling and more generally on the overlap between AGI work and the human brain, understanding of the human brain, attempts to create AGI systems inspired at various levels of precision by the human brain. And as the chair of this session, I invited Dr. Randal Koene, who's a genuine neuroscientist, which I hope will give a little more depth to the discussions afterwards in terms of grounding our speculations about modeling the brain and connecting our AI to the brain with what is known about how the brain actually functions, which is not complete knowledge by any means, but a lot of progress has been made. Randal, actually, I got to know through his work on the notion of mind uploading and kind of scanning the brain, figuring out how can you model the brain such that ultimately brains can be put into computers, which is a fascinating topic on its own. If you Google them, you'll find out about the mind uploading research group. But for now, we will focus on neural net models, AGI models, how they relate to the brain. And I'll turn it over to Randal.
Thanks, Ben. Okay, I'm here for the first day today, so I'm assuming that you all know exactly how the format works, but I'm just going to run through it for a second, just so we're all on the same level. So my name is Randal Koene, and Ben already introduced me. I'm a research assistant professor at Boston University and also a research associate at the VU University in Amsterdam. And what I do is basically computational neuroscience with an emphasis on brain-machine interfaces and neurotheses. The talks in this session, 4 talks, are focused on new methods and discoveries in neural networks, so connectionism, that could in some way advance artificial general intelligence. That's an overriding concept to keep in mind, of course, and especially a focus on that general part of the AI that makes this conference special. Do you know cascade correlation networks?
No, but the general assumption I was starting with your statement, this network is not adjusting or learning as it's going on. So the connections are fixed. And then this is a distinction that's kind of tough to make because there's a big focus on networks in learning and modifying the connection weights and connection weights being central to part of the processing. Here, there's no modification of connection weights. It's the activation of the inputs that's being modified. The connection weights stay the same throughout the whole thing. So, and it's a little counterintuitive, but what happens is each input kind of gets evaluated about how much it's worth to the network through this feedback. And if an input activates the whole network, well, it's ambiguous, everybody's using it, so it's not worth as much, and it gets inhibited by the activation of the whole network coming back. So it's not adjusting connection weights there.
And would you say it's changing the structure?
No, the structure is all the same. When I give different inputs in there, it's just the activation throughout the network that's changing. It's not the structure. So once I set up, one node takes one input, another node takes 2 inputs, that stays the same, and it never changes in this sort of network. So it's very counterintuitive, and it takes a while to get into because a lot of the literature is connection weights and changing.
Well, cascade correlational networks basically, as I understand, they grow new nodes as well as new links.
Yes, they grow new nodes and new links to the input as well.
Right.
Yeah, so that's why.
Right, and what I presented here didn't have learning in it. Basically, I said one node takes 2 input, another node takes another set of inputs and just make the connections based on that. And when I had the letters, basically, I give a letter, whatever features there are, I just connect to those features, and then I give several letters and see how the network behaves. So the learning is much simpler here. You don't have to learn connection ways, just connect to features, and the structure doesn't change.
Hugo. Well, first of all, great to see FPGAs being used in a very constructive way. I myself am very interested in using them. Actually, I'd like to talk about that later, about models in which you grow neurons and have functions that you could perhaps embed in FPGAs to do that. But I'll talk about that later. My question right now is that, as you already pointed out, the number of modules is still fairly limited. It's 10,000 or 15,000, maybe 50,000. And inside the modules, you use about 12 to 20 neurons, or I believe, or assemblies, perhaps we can call them that, if they're not supposed to represent individual neurons. Still, even with the maximum number that you showed, that brings us to a total of, say, 1 million neurons, which is very small when you compare that to the number of neurons you find in any biological brains. And I was just wondering if you think there are particular additional challenges that you might face as you try to scale this up.
I guess I just plead ignorant. As far as I know, nobody has tried to do this kind of thing. So there are no precedents. So I don't know what problems I'm going to have. So to prove that the method is interesting, works, I just need to build something.
Is there a particular reason why the modules themselves have very limited?
Yes. Well, it's a bit technical. If you empirically, we found that if you go over about 20, and these neural network modules are fully connected. Right? Every artificial neuron has a connection to all the others. So if you have n of them, n squared connections. And if n is more than say 20 or so, the evolvability drops, which is interesting. And I can give a technical reason, but I need to write equations. So we just stick with about 12, 16 neurons per module.
But did you try that without the assumption of full connectivity?
Yeah.
And the evolvability still drops?
Well, there's still limits. Yeah. So, well, for those of you who know neural networks, you have to have a nonlinear squashing function. And that squashing function asymptotes. So if you have too many modules, the asymptotic
Too many neurons.
Too many neurons, yeah. Sorry, jet lag. The output asymptotes towards a straight line. And then the difference between the curve and the limit gets so tiny, eventually it gets too small for the computer finite word length to be able to cope with. That's my suspicion. But empirically, the evolvability drops if you go too large.
Yeah, that's worth digging into later. I would guess that if you make some other assumption about the kind of statistical pattern of connectivity, you could get something that was evolvable. Like make it a scale-free network or something, and then evolve it.
This whole approach, the concept of evolvability is critical. Like for example, what do you do when it just doesn't evolve? What do you do? And about the only approach.
Give up and build a logic-based.
No, you give up. You give up on that particular model, and you try another model. And usually after 2-3 years.
But seriously, it seems like if you make a scale-free connectivity statistics or something different, you might be able to get evolvability of a larger network.
We've got to talk.
Also, I mean, there was very promising work in the 90s, like Tano and other people doing like great quantity of grammatical encodings for neural nets.
Yeah.
And dealing with this problem, you could grow really large nets by evolving not the connectivity, but the generative system that gave you the connectivity.
Well, there's the work by Mikkelainen on marker-based evolution of neural nets too. You take a kind of sequence, which is it's a sequence where there's a region of the sequence corresponding to the synapses for each neuron. You do genetic operations on that sequence. The sequence is then decoded to make a network. Then he can evolve pretty large neural modules too. So my guess is the complete connectivity is makes the search space weird. Huh?
The starting from fully connected was the most general. So if a connection should not exist, it would involve
That's true.
zero.
Yeah, but the brain is not a general neural network, right? It has a highly special statistics.
Specialized neurons of different types, and interneurons versus principal neurons. It's got feedback and inhibition and all that.
It's not that big. Give them a chance to, I mean, they got a chance to do something that involves it all, so it's the hard part of doing it, the real hard part.
There's a fundamental question approach here. Like, do you want to be, quote, a slave to neuroscience, or do you want to be free and be engineers? Well, I sort of do both, and it's very eclectic, right? So I try to read neuroscience and ethology, which is a study of animal behavior, and AGI and cognitive science, anything for ideas, because I know the next major challenge is architectures. We've got the method, now we have to use it.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just add to that, I think that's important. And also, the term I like to think of is one of these representational principles that you can get from neuroscience. If you're doing something that sort of, looks completely different from anything that's known about the way the brain does things, that's probably the wrong direction to go. Maybe not, but it's probably the wrong direction to go.
At least don't call it neural networks then.
Right. Well, what I'm saying is that, you can get a lot of, I mean, I think to me a lot of the solutions for AGI are going to come from knowing about the way the brain works. Maybe not in absolute detail, because I don't think people know that neuroscientists don't know much about the details. I'm not speculating about that. But, the sort of the principles about the way computation is done, seems to be done in the brain versus the way it's traditionally done in AI is really good kind of, I think, to focus on. It's independent of any other.
Yeah, I don't personally agree with that, but it's certainly a valid point of view.
See if we get Macron to come, AGI-09.
Exactly, this would be a question. You probably are familiar with the work of Macron in Lausanne at the Brain Mind Institute, and in a way he proposes something similar, even though with a completely different methodology. He's focusing on building cortical columns and interlinking them. How would you contrast this to your own work? I mean, if you look at what you are proposing, it seems to me as if you were suggesting taking flocks of brain cells and putting them each in a dish and training them towards some not very strictly defined fitness function, and then gluing the whole thing together, putting it in a bucket, adding wheels, and saying that this is brain. Maybe I didn't understand it completely, but maybe could you contrast this to the work which is Macron doing, how it is different and how it is going to work, and then explain how by evolving it individually, these different things and towards a goal which is not completely clear to me. If you put all these things together, they are going to produce a behavior which gives a meaningful outcome, which teaches us how a brain works and eventually achieves general intelligence.
Well, from my understanding, what I've read of Macron, by the way, for those of you not familiar with Macron's work, it's probably the sexiest artificial brain project in the world. He's getting huge media attention. He's got an IBM Blue Gene computer. He, as far as I understand, he electrocutes individual neurons and records the signaling to other neurons. So he's putting the huge amounts of data on the connectivity of neurons in a cortical column, with each neuron connecting to about 10,000 other neurons, and a cortical column typically in the mouse has about 10,000 neurons. So 10,000 squared, so what, 100 million connections. And he now has that data, and you see these fabulous pictures of the connectivity of a single cortical column. And so he's getting the detailed microcircuitry of a real brain, and that's sort of new. And so a lot of attention. And he claims, with Moore's law and so forth, that he'll be able to do that over the whole cortex in, 10, 15 years. That is spectacular claims. So how's that different from what I'm doing? Well, I mean, his obviously is strongly biologically based. Mine may be somewhat biologically inspired, but I'm not bound to the biological approach. It's engineering. I can do what I like. But my big problem is I don't know what to do. That's the problem.
An interesting corollary on this one is that I happened to have seen Macron just a week ago, 2 weeks ago, and he told me that although he's developing this very detailed single column model, and it's very important to him to understand exactly how all of those pieces work out, because the single column is considered as the main computational component of what's going on in the neocortex. his actual views of how these things work in the brain are much more valuable. He believes that, for instance, if you were to attach any device to the brain, that the brain will learn how to talk to this device and how to work with it, no matter where it is, how you connect it. If you attach this to the retinal input or to something else, doesn't matter. So he has a very general, very flexible view of how the brain works, which kind of jives well with this more general neural network approach.
Yeah, I mean, I might also, if you haven't read the book, put in a plug for Andy Clark's book, Natural Born Cyborgs, where he basically, I mean, he takes some sort of evolutionary psychology and a lot of the dogma about, why we think of everything. He says basically what our brains have evolved to be is exactly this kind of thing. Our brains are devices that we can plug into anything and adapt to it rather than us having to adapt to the technology. So I mean, I think it's also a useful metaphor for AGI. It's also a useful way of finding people who are too biological, so argue the other side of the street.
Okay, I've got the microphone. Well, I have a question for several of you. First, speaker Tsvi?
Yes.
Tsvi, okay. Are you familiar with the perceptual maps that, for example, Tsvi Achler at Recon Brain Science is developing? That's also kind of, no hidden layer perceptual maps with two layers talking to each other in somehow similar way. And actually, there's lots of psychophysics now experiments that are modeled in this way. Most problems require somehow hidden layers. So the first question is, how can you do things which are non-linearly separable? The XOR problem, for example, if you don't have a hidden layer, which has been a problem before. Now, the second is, you show 4 letters and say, oh, SVM doesn't classify that. But normally, we do some segmentation first, and then we segment them one after another. So I just can't imagine why it should do that on the composite picture, and then what? It tells you A, B, C, D. So, okay, that's the first one. Now, let's move to Igor.
Wait, can I answer that? Or?
Yeah, but then I'll hold on the microphone. Okay, yeah.
Okay. So, true, you have segmentation, but segmentation is not perfect. And human brains can also process things in parallel.
That's controversial, I would say.
So, you have
shift of attention, and there are good models of showing how we shift attention from one to the other, and in this way, it's
for example,
What do you say to that, Randall?
It's modularity specific, isn't it? If you're doing things, if you need to pay attention to things that involve different modularity, different parts of your brain, different regions, then you can do them in parallel.
Right.
If you require the same, let's say it's 2 visual tasks or 2 things that you need to do with
you obviously have to do these arcades to see all the elements of your picture that you have. And
even with that, the work of Duncan and Humphreys show that even in the thing with visual processing, depending on how similar the stimuli are, things can be done in parallel, and it's really how much interaction there are between the stimuli will determine how parallel, or serial, the term that are used, this sort of thing can be. So, also to segment, you have to know what you're looking for.
well, in the simulators like emergence of PDP++, for example, that the Riley has done, this comes naturally because of the dorsal pass, which will then focus on where things are, right? And then you have the ventral part, which is the object recognition. Both of them cooperate. They're good biologically motivated vision models that do that quite nicely.
But sure, but then that means, I'm not saying no segmentation, but I'm trying to say that the more flexibility that the classifier has, the more it can deal with missegmentations, with novel things that it's never seen before, with all sorts of problems like that. And then sure, areas that it still doesn't recognize well, go and segment. But the thing is, if the training set is limited to the distributions are the same, then you're relying much stronger on this segmentation, which may not be perfect. So my point is that sure, you can put that in, but I on purpose didn't put that in to compare the resilience of the networks.
We should move on to your question.
I have a question to Igor then. If you know the function, you can program it. If you don't know the function, for example, vision, okay? how are you going to evolve your models in vision? I mean, there is so many steps inside that we don't have the access to. What happens if I know the function, I can set up some kind of cost function and an experiment in which I evolve that. But how are you imagining that you are going to evolve object recognition? I mean, just any function, right?
Okay, I get asked this all the time.
Well, I asked you that 10 years ago, and I haven't heard the answer 10 years ago, so I hope you do it now.
Here's the objection, like in a nutshell. If you can specify the fitness function, why don't you just program it? Why bother evolving it?
Yeah.
And why not just do that for the whole thing?
Right.
Just program everything. Some simple functions, that's true. It would be quicker just to program, specify, especially like an AND gate or something. But in practice, especially for pattern recognizers, I don't know, and I don't even bother to try to understand how my evolving or evolved circuits work. But well, not always, but they do.
Why should they work if you don't have a cost function? How are you going to do this?
Well, okay, say I want to evolve a detector of a particular shape on a two-dimensional grid with photo cells that send input to a neural net that you evolve to, that will give a strong output for a particular pattern, picture, whatever. They tend to work very well, and I can evolve the thing in a matter of seconds, and if I had to program it, I wouldn't even know where to start. So.
But that's evolving a detector for some particular shape, like a banana or an apple or something.
Yeah,
How would it work? How would it work in an unsupervised way if a robot has to kind of identify what are the kinds of shapes in its environment that are important and know which ones it has to learn a classifier for? I see if it's supervised learning and you give it 100 examples of a banana, then you can train it to do that. But that's kind of a very narrow methodology that doesn't reflect a robot's real life.
And I mean, how do you get the invariance in this just from simple network, right? I mean, visual system has many steps, and before you get to the object recognition, the IT region, the infratemporal cortex, there are so many different steps on the way that I don't see how you can, have like 5 steps on the way, different transformations based only on what you see, what you observe, and your inputs. I mean, there is no, unless you have an access to the internal information, what happens, you just can't do that.
Well, these are all very good questions, and I don't have quick, easy answers. The only real defense I can make is nobody has tried to put huge numbers of evolved neural nets together before.
It won't come from numbers itself. I mean, Ben said on the first day that we probably have enough computational power, and I quite agree. We probably have enough. We just need to know how to structure that. And I don't see how evolving that will help because we don't know.
The problem is knowing what the cost functions are for the modules in the first place, actually.
Yes, and you'll have to have the access to internal information in the brain if you want to go the brain way, or some other...
Either that or have a very clever and creative constructive theory of what all the cost functions are.
To have all the transformations on the way.
Your question about the visual perception problem is actually an interesting tie into Simon's talk, who hasn't had a chance yet. But any questions here? Because I noticed at the end of your talk, you were referring to this way of doing visual perception. I think it was MSC?
Yeah, that's a Dave Aragon's MAPC.
Yeah. I noticed there that it seems like a way that you might be able to build an actual object-based visual perception method by using first simple visual perception at an early level, but then using your new architecture to create an object-based approach to vision, which is something that hasn't been done very much, since most of the effort seems to have gone into template matching and other techniques like that.
Yeah, I think that kind of nails sort of the next step that Ross Baylor and I are hoping to do, which is, I need to get an implementation in MATLAB or something with Ruby of these map seeking circuits going. And by the way, I'll put another plug in for open source. A lot of good ideas don't get disseminated. AGI is just one of those examples because people just they do a hacked up demo in C++ and it's totally brittle, unreadable code. And if you want your ideas to be spread, you should put open source software on a web page and do a good job of it. But getting back to your question, that that's sort of what we're trying to do, is trying to combine various solutions to various problems, like the problem that Aragon is addressing is basically invariance, and the problem of the exponential growth of trying to apply many, many transformations simultaneously. And essentially the way he solved it is sort of with some inspiration from essentially recurrent connections in the cortex. So you sort of settle on in parallel, you settle on the set of transformations that will give you the object. So you get out of this network, you get both the object that it thinks it's recognizing as a pixel pattern or as an index, as well as the set of transformations, the composition that gave you that, right? So you get, in a sense, you kind of get a where and a what, if you want to relate it to kind of neuroscience terms, right? The what is the thing you recognize, the where is roughly the set of transformations that put it into that place, affine transformations.
And I'd like to pose a question to Ben, who has also not had a chance yet to talk to everyone. First of all, I was very happy, of course, to see the connection being made between what we're doing in AI versus what we're doing in computational neuroscience. And during his talk, a lot of different questions came up. But first of all, I would like to address what you were saying about the problem of having these ongoing, I would call them chains or cascades of inference without any end. And the problem, you can't just use some kind of a tag on a train and figure out whether you've already been there.
Did you discover the tag?
There's so many tags. It's kind of what you were already mentioning. You mentioned the absolute refractory period. You mentioned after hyperpolarization. So real neurons aren't constrained by nature, of course. They can't simply continue. Now, what kind of constraint you're looking for depends on the sort of code that you're using. If you're using a temporal code where it matters when spikes occur in the neurons, then these sort of things like after hyperpolarization are perfect ways to make sure a neuron can't spike again. If you're looking at a rate, on the other hand, then perhaps that's not the way to go. And there are higher order things in the brain also, say rhythms in the brain that will either make it more susceptible to spiking or make spiking harder, which also will influence whether or not a chain of say, spiking can continue or if it ends at some point. So there are definitely some constraints there. I think that the flood that you were talking about is probably not going to happen any more than you can just excite a synapse greater than a certain level and have its strength increase to some greater level than is absolutely possible in biology. And then lastly, I wanted to ask you if you had thought about say we were talking about the mini columns or the columns that Penny Mark was looking at before, and you were wondering about how you could put assemblies within assemblies. Had you thought about perhaps converging streams of activity between mini columns? So you could have a stream that's activating from the target, and a stream that's activating from wherever you are, whatever you're busy with, what you're doing, your current status. And through the mini columns, by connecting them, you can create a stream that will create an output where those streams match. Now you can inject other mini columns that are doing some kind of representative task like that within the stream, so that would be kind of hierarchical inheritance.
Right, so then you basically, in essence, you're getting assemblies within assemblies within assemblies, which is would then, in terms of the diagrams I was drawing, that would lead to what I was calling a neural inheritance relationship, where you'd have if one assembly was active, then the other one would be active with a certain probability, depending on the containment relationship.
Right, yeah.
And that's one of the interesting things about drawing these abstract kind of inheritance graphs between assemblies, is the abstract graph you get of probabilistic implications. It's kind of independent of whether these assemblies are contained within each other, they overlap each other, or they're separate from each other. However those physical relationships hold, you can still draw kind of abstract links between the assemblies just based on if this guy is active, how likely is it that this guy is active otherwise. But I agree, it's not obvious at all how the sort of geometric relations between the assemblies are going to come out if you make a real large-scale simulation here to give rise to logic. Actually, that ties in to work my wife is helping me with trying to actually measure this stuff. So what she's doing is taking a cichlid fish which can carry out basic transitive inference. So fish can reason A implies B, B implies C, A implies C in the context of status hierarchy. If A can beat up B, B can beat up C, then A can beat up C. But no one has done that with probabilistic reasoning yet. Like how often can A beat up B? How often can B beat up C? So the experimental paradigm is to try to see how a fish estimates the probability that A will beat up C based on how often A beats up B and B beats up C. But then you can put tetrodes in the brain of the fish and measure what's happening with a few thousand neurons while it's doing that. And whether you can really measure the neural trace of the probabilistic inference depends on exactly the kind of thing you're saying. Like, how are these assemblies actually geometrically related to each other? And can you actually measure the assemblies within a trace of them within the few thousand neurons you can get from sticking the tetrode in the fish's brain?
Well, that would be difficult because I would assume that each one of these columns consisting of hundreds and thousands of neurons are involved in multiple different kinds of traces and only active when
That's
point in a street.
That's right, but you know, even if an attractor is very large and complex, just looking at a little tiny piece of it, you can still see a signature of the attractor there, like in the slices through attractors in high-dimensional space. So even if you're just getting a little sample of the attractor wave, you may be able to distinguish it from the data.
Yes, I've got the light here, I think. It just goes back to the discussion that was 20 minutes ago, maybe 10 minutes ago, where you're talking about whether Hugo should have a fully connected net and what was biologically plausible. I just want to suggest another model, which is Valiant's model, which is said to be biologically plausible. That might be interesting to you.
Valiant.
That's Valiant. That's Valiant has a neuroidal model in which
Doesn't do
neuroids
evolution.
are intended to not be a single neuron, but some cluster of neuron that has some state and some other properties. And the neuroids are connected into a large random graph of degree of order, something like root n, having the nice property that if you pick two of them, they have some reasonable number of common neighbors, like say 100. Which is kind of necessary if you want to do things like if you have two concepts, you want to learn the conjunct of that concept, and you can find some other neuroids that then can represent that concept. So it's claimed that this is all very consistent with biology. It's a model that's actually going on the brain, and he makes various predictions and stuff, but it might actually be a useful structure for you to study.
A few years back, when quantum computers were first starting to be implemented, someone or other claimed that they were going to have 64-qubit quantum computers in a few years. And a friend of mine said, "Man, I can't wait to get my hands on one of those." And I said, "What are you going to do with 64 qubits?" And he said, "I don't know, but I'll doing it very fast." So my question is for Ben. So you talked about two themes. And one of them was loopy and cyclic probabilistic reasoning not spinning out of control. And the other one was higher order reasoning. It's bad enough when our Bayesian networks start to get loose in them, but one suspects that when you go to object-oriented or probabilistic relational networks and start trying to reason about what the rules are, you're going to have the rules from the seventh circle of purgatory, because if you think about gravity, deducing the laws of physics for gravity, well, gravity is everywhere. So that's the largest kind of loop you can have in your Bayesian network. Gravity and one other rule, and conservation of momentum combining, for example. Those two rules together governing thousands of objects. Now, there's sort of various standard answers to this, but they don't work very well. So I was wondering if you observed at all what happens when you have loops in higher order logic, and whether the answer that come out would make any sense.
No, because we never did a simulation involving both. I mean, we just did very simple toy scripts just to see if the ideas made any sense at all. I would say that the big lesson for me conceptually out of the thing with loops is that in the neural nets that we played with, the solution to loops kind of came out of both the lower level details of the neural functions, as Randal was mentioning, and then the way that the neural net is used in a real context in terms of processing perceptions. Whereas if you ran the same neural net under a more artificial regime of which neurons you stimulate, you would get loops and everything would go crazy. So I think the thing I'm getting at there is, in principle, putting together loops and higher order functions certainly would almost always lead to a horrifying mess. But it may be that the way that information is actually channeled into different parts of the brain, the things the brain actually does, has evolved to bypass that problem in a whole bunch of specialized and hacky ways, because it's not a general purpose system. But there would be years of work and many PhD theses in toying with systems like that to try to get real answers to these questions. I think it's there, which is part of the reason I don't like this approach to AGI too much. It's really nasty, huge, complex, nonlinear, dynamical systems, and they're fascinating things, but there's just so much trial and error in experimenting with them and seeing how it works until the neuroscientists give us a lot more guidance than they've done so far.
But why are you talking about loops? I mean, you just have 3 groups of neurons synchronized, that's all. And it's simultaneous. I mean, the processes are fast enough. If you think about loops, you think that you have activated one, then the other, then the third, etc. It all happens very quickly, and you just have 3 groups of neurons synchronized.
Right, and then it kind of settles into an attractor.
Right.
But that 3 group, that triangle is connected to another triangle, which is connected to another triangle, which is connected to another triangle.
Yeah.
Some of those triangles are activated sometimes, others at other times, and you need all the weights of all of those to be consistent probabilistically instead of just degenerating it into some kind of noise.
We have a neuroscientist who think that there are recurrent processes of this.
We're already going over our time to some degree, so perhaps we should limit this continuing discussion to maybe a few more questions.
Actually, it's what time is it now? It's 6:15. 10:12. It is 10:12, and we need to leave the room at noon. So we should probably do 3 or 4 more minutes of this. Then we can have a 10-minute break and do an abbreviated version of the panel discussion. I basically decided to let this go on longer because it seemed like it's an interesting conversation.
Okay, so we'll do a few more minutes of this.
Yeah.
Hi, Leo Trotty. I'm a PhD student at UC San Diego in cognitive science. This is kind of a generally directed comment. Okay, many people here seem to be very concerned with how to implement and architect logic and inference. I'm pretty sure the brain or mind doesn't do this in anything like a direct way. It might do some ad hoc associations in particular restricted contexts, but most of its resources are in no way whatsoever dedicated to HAL-style cognition. This is what we've learned from the last 50 years of good old-fashioned artificial intelligence distribution. So here, in my opinion, is how it is that we seem to do logic and inference. Our culture has developed conventions, largely in language, for what counts as semantically valid sentence constructions and utterances. But these cultural rules and conventions are not really rule-governed or fully rule-describable. These cultural conventions and inference structures usually don't adhere strictly to any particular rules, and they're as context-sensitive as a culture will ever be. But these cultural conventions produce the illusion that we are rule-governed and doing computation-style abstract thought, because that's how academic and geek cultures operate, which is what we are. So if we want to see how it is that we do logic, we need to look at how humans adopt and learn sociolinguistic conventions, how it is that we successfully conform to the very sophisticated cultural structures we humans have spent tens of thousands of years evolving. And we need to recognize that any ability we have to do logic is based fundamentally in the messiness of our culture and language.
Any question?
That logic is quite a little bit useful.
How does the AGI community might begin to approach things from this kind of learning called sociolinguistic cultural convention?
I guess my feeling is that the whole train of thought underlying the talk I just gave is kind of in direct opposition to that idea. And I think there's a lot of parallels between what we see in Hebbian learning in the brain and what we see in uncertain logic. And I think if you look at crisp logic, you see a big difference. Whereas if you look at probabilistic reasoning, more of the parallels start to appear. And there's loads of papers in the last 5 years on Bayesian learning in the brain. And so my view is that probability theory has the potential to serve as the glue between what happens in the brain with neural population codes and the like, and on the other hand, what happens in logic systems.
I also want to comment that, in fact, knowing how the circuits in the brain work, or how they're connecting and all that, very little is known. I mean, you know from MRI, this region lights up, that region lights up. You don't even know if it's positive or negative, you just know it's oxygen consumption. So really, there's a big disconnect, even from electrophysiology of a single cell. Well, you don't know what the rest of the circuit's doing. So really, there is this amorphous jump that needs to be made from actual what's able to be recorded from neuroscience to
I think we find that behaviorally people do stuff that seems to exhibit at kind of a motor level more or less optimal style behavior. But that doesn't mean that the stuff that we do when we're talking about logic and when we're doing kind of collective reasoning has anything to do with like the fancy structures and rule-based things we see in like a language like logic.
Sure, what we perceive, how we think, or how the things come up in our brain is not necessarily how it's coming up and so on.
Yeah, and just to address that, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to what you said. I'm probably 90% sympathetic. The thing that, if there's a question at the end of your very well reasoned argument, it's, what sorts of things might we be better off avoiding, what sorts of things has this kind of classical view helped us with. And I would argue that the kinds of things we should avoid are attempts to solve problems like exclusive OR, focusing so much on those, because those are things that have been useful for constructing artifacts like digital computers, and therefore somehow we must focus on those and no, that sucks if we can't do XOR. So that's where I agree with you. Where I think the point where I might disagree with you is I think there are things that are sort of just almost metaphysically so essential to describe human cognition, like for example the binding problem, that they seem to show up in neuroscience, for example, as much as they show up in classical Go-Fi, or at least I think it was good classical Go-Fi, and that those kinds of things from classical AI aren't going to go away, and those are the kinds of logical or quasi-logical operations we should be focusing on. That's why I focus so much on binding in my own work.
Right, I think we're going to have to cut this session off. We actually have gone way over time, but the discussion was interesting, so we started late. We should take a brief, maybe 10-minute break and come back and then do the panel discussion, because we have to vacate the room at noon.